Hello, everyone. My name is Susan Eko. I will be representing the American Society of Adaptation Professionals today. Welcome to our session on modeling in migration and preparing for risk and opportunities. Today, I'll be presenting with three other people. We have Anna, we have Osamu, and we have Isaac. I'll have them introduce themselves shortly. So who would like to go first?
Hi, sorry, I didn't expect that. I'm Anna Morandi. I'm with the National League of Cities. I'm a program manager there, and yeah, I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Isaac Endler. I am an independent researcher on climate adaptation and housing policy, and it's just my pleasure to be here.
Hello, my name is Osamu Kumasaka. I am the program director for buy-in community planning.
Great, thank you, everyone. So basically today we'll be sharing some of ASAP's work on climate migration in the Great Lakes region and New York State. And so how the panel presentation will go today will be that I will just introduce you to what ASAP does and speak about a little bit about our migration work. And then the way we've structured our presentation today will be to approach climate in migration at different scales, where we talk about the scales at the regional level, speaking about our work in the Great Lakes region, and also speaking specifically about our work in New York State on housing. And then we will also speak about it from a municipal level. After that, there will be a facilitated panel conversation. And following that, we're going to have a Q&A session. So if you have any questions, please leave them in the chat function or in the Q&A section, and we'll get to them at the end of the presentation. So first of all, I would like to introduce you to ASAP. ASAP basically is an organization that brings together adaptation professionals across North America. These are people who are working on climate adaptation and resilience projects. And basically it's a space where they can come together, learn together, share ideas, network, and explore opportunities within the network. And so we have different members cut across different industries and sectors. We have representatives from academia, the government, nonprofit agencies, the private sector as well. And we are represented by members across 48 states in the United States, as well as 3 Canadian provinces and across 4 different countries. And so it's a very diverse pool of people that come together and work on these issues. Part of our work specifically has to do with climate migration, which I'll be sharing with you right now. And so ASAP basically conducts 2 major climate migration work. And this work is funded by GLISA, which is the Great Lakes Integrated Sciences Agency, and also NYSERDA. Basically, the work is cut across 2 different major areas, one of which is to develop methodologies for predicting climate migration that integrate future climate projections. So what this means is that we have 2 accelerator teams who work on the methodologies. And one of it is focused on a Great Lakes wide area, whereby what they try to do is to predict climate immigration into the Great Lakes region by utilizing data on demography to try to figure out how the demography changes as climate migration pushes people from where they currently live to seek other places to live. And so it tries to do that by using county-specific data and also age-segmented data. The second accelerator team works on housing issues. So with climate immigration for climate receiving regions, it's important to understand how that creates housing pressures and how housing needs need to be addressed. So that second accelerator team is working on that. We'll be hearing about those two different projects today on the panel. The second part of our work involves being able to develop typologies from stakeholders and indigenous rights holder perspectives on climate-induced immigration in the Great Lakes region. What this means is that we coordinate and we engage with stakeholders and rights holders within the region through focus groups and intermediary conversations. So what that involves is that we try to find out their perspectives on what their needs are, how they feel like climate immigration can affect them and the work that they do within their communities, and try to understand their perspective, needs, the risks and opportunities associated with climate immigration. Currently, we have conducted 2 focus group discussions. We've done that with local government agencies and natural resource managers. We have a few more focus groups to go within the second year of this project, which will involve speaking with tribal communities, talking to environmental justice organizations, community-based organizations, and even state government representatives. And then also, eventually, our goal is to deliver outreach and education opportunities for climate adaptation professionals. So this is done through organizing a climate change and demography workshop. We had one last year, and another one will be conducted this December. If you would like to be part of that, I'll speak about how you can do that at the end of the presentation. So we just offer these outreach opportunities that in a way that we're able to engage not only practitioners, but also communities and people that have been engaged in the project since its inception. One of the outputs of our research so far in the first year has been a literature review. And through that literature review, what we tried to do was to explore barriers and opportunities associated with climate immigration to the Great Lakes region. And these are just some of our findings. One major finding that had to do with like a barrier of climate immigration has to do with the challenges involved with integrating data or lack of data in general. Data is something that needs to be, we need more data on this issue, this topic within the region. We also have found that when we're exploring climate change and demographic change, a lot of the research on it tends to be focused in rural areas, so in urban areas. So we need more research in rural areas to be able to understand how these changes happen. And we specifically are able to do this by approaching this from a county level specific data with the demography research. And also in these areas, we can think about the region in general, we can think about legacies of injustice and how that has created inequalities among different groups of people, disenfranchised communities within the region, and how climate immigration might affect those existing legacies of injustice. Within the Great Lakes region, we have certain states that have been experiencing population decline because a lot of people are moving out, brain drain, whereby skilled workers are moving out to other places. And also with climate immigration, there's a potential for social and cultural resistance to new demographics of people that might be moving in. But even though these seem like barriers, they also present opportunities. That's how we like to look at it. So basically, what we see as opportunities are the fact that we can, in terms of data, we will be able to develop tools and frameworks that not only consider historical trends, but also look to the future using climate data that projects climate change to the future, which we believe is able to capture, based on the research, it shows that it might be able to capture changes in demography that may not be accounted for with other models that have been used in the past. And also, we believe that in the Great Lakes region, based on research and the review, the findings suggest that climate vulnerabilities within the Great Lakes region, which may not be as intense as other parts of the country, will make it an attraction for climate migrants. There are a lot of cities already thinking about this and trying to put it into their adaptation planning to establish themselves as climate refuge cities. And so this is an opportunity to attract people that could facilitate economic growth within the region. Also, because the Great Lakes has access to fresh water, this is also an attraction for migrants who might be looking for where to move to. It also creates opportunities for economic growth through three key industries that we've identified in the literature: the manufacturing industry, tourism, and agriculture. And so our goal for this research, the outcome, is we hope that with this project, we're able to establish a foundation for socially just and environmentally responsible growth in climate-receiving regions. We believe that environmental justice and social justice is really key if we're thinking about these issues. We also hope that as these methodologies and outputs and applications and tools become developed, that they will be owned and controlled by affected communities. That's really important, that the people who are the most affected by this will be able to have control of how these research is being developed and how it will be applied, especially as it relates to policy making. And beyond that, we hope that by focusing on this area of research, we're able to catalyze investment into this area of adaptation research, catalyze more research in this area as well. We also hope that we're able to develop tools and frameworks that can be applicable to other climate receiving regions. And we hope more broadly that beyond identifying risks associated with climate change, that this project serves as an opportunity for identifying opportunities. And so the second part of this panel presentation is supposed to be speaking specifically about our projects. And Matt was supposed to be here, but he has a concurrent presentation at this conference. So I will try to be able to present what he has prepared here, which is basically a focus of climate migration in and out of the Great Lakes region. Matt uses climate modeling and demography to be able to predict climate migration into the Great Lakes region. And so the idea is to produce simple and replicable methodology for understanding climate migration. And even though the research starts by using historical analysis, it also tries to incorporate future climate data predictions. And basically to see how migration works in terms of who comes into the Great Lakes region and from where, and the role that temperature might play in mediating the relationship. So basically the data that was used for this methodology development is IRS data at the county level, which is basically migrants are identified by when they move from one county to another within a given year, and the addresses change, that is noted as someone who is a migrant. So using that data, and also using a climate data set on GridMet, which basically involves using average annual daily temperatures, the means and maximum temperatures for counties. And so a gravity model was built, and basically The number of migrants moving between counties is a function of distance. It's also a function of population size and the difference in mean temperatures between counties. And it includes 120,000 county year pairs of data. So in terms of the results, what Matt's team is finding is that there's a statistically significant positive relationship between temperature and the number of migrants moving into the Great Lakes region. This means that as the temperatures increase, people tend to move towards colder areas and they tend to move towards the Great Lakes region. This is important if we're thinking about future climate predictions. Also, on the flip side, Matt's team also finds a statistically significant but negative relationship between temperature differentials and the number of migrants moving out of the Great Lakes region. We saw in the previous slides that increase in temperatures bring people into the Great Lakes region, but within the Great Lakes region itself, as temperature differentials increase, the number of migrants tend to decrease. Migrants out of the Great Lakes region tend to go towards more colder areas. So these are things that we need to consider in the near future. And so moving on, what they hope to do with this team research is to look at additional climate variables. For example, to be able to include the number of days above 90 degrees, to access and examine thresholds, and also further develop demographic modeling. So I'll hand it over to Isaac and Osamu, who will be speaking more specifically about this work in New York State.
Thank you, Susan. We really greatly enjoyed your presentation. Hello, everyone. I hope that your morning is going well. My name is Isaac Endler.
And my name is Osamu Kumasaka.
And we're here to present to you our team's work on anticipating climate change-induced migration into and within New York State. Feel free to use the chat and Q&A to ask questions. So, next slide, please. Thank you. So, for an outline of what we're going to do, we're going to begin this presentation talking about what our project is. We're then going to segue into what we have done so far, specifically, what is the big picture literature review about housing, mobility, climate risk, and climate migration within New York State? What are the info sessions with experts and policymakers that we've conducted? What is the migration model diagramming we've been doing? Then we're going to talk about our first round of GIS analysis and what that means. And what are we going to be doing next with all of this? Specifically, what do we plan to work on in regards to housing vulnerability analysis and also policy analysis? So, as promised, let me tell you about our project. Our work is funded by NYSERDA. For those of you who don't know, NYSERDA is the New York State Energy Research and Development Authority. And of course, our focus is New York State, primarily climate change-induced migration into and within the state. The project will acknowledge, incorporate, and explore many ongoing questions surrounding climate migrants in state and local policies, planning, and programs oriented at supporting these populations in sending and receiving areas. We will present findings for New York State policymakers to consider as they surface to try to help them understand the issue. This presentation is an update on our work to date. So our team is one of two supported by the ASAP Climate Modeling Migration Accelerator to help communities anticipate, prepare for, and integrate climate migrants. In 2018, 16.1 million globally were displaced because of weather-related disasters. Of those, more than 1.2 million were Americans. From our literature review, it It seems journalists, academics, and policymakers are paying the most attention to migration following extreme weather events. But sea level rise due to climate change will continue to threaten areas where millions of Americans live, with episodic sunny day tidal flooding, and all but the lowest projections retreat or relocation of communities from highly flood-prone areas will be unavoidable, according to the U.S. Global Change Research Program. Because of this, our research questions are: how might state agencies like NYSERDA anticipate how climate migration both into and within New York State may play out under different hurricane scenarios? And what policies and programs might provide frontline residents with appropriate relocation assistance, housing, and other infrastructure to support moves to safer homes? So for a little timeline of what our project's been like, we established a team last year in December 2020 after the New Cities climate migration event. Then in January 2021, a month later, we submitted our research questions to NYSERDA. They were approved. And now we are currently working on and researching analysis with Learning Lab meetings. And at the end of this year, fully 12 months after we started this project, we'll be finalizing our project findings and research for publication. Well, so now we are a team of young professionals affiliated with ASAP working on this project. None of us have any major experience in demographic modeling, but we are interested in participating in this accelerator as a learning experience. It's been really great to have Matt Howard and other ASAP experts to advise our progress, paradigm shifting. So to begin, as you know, my name is Isaac Gendler. By day, I work as a utilities engineer for the California Public Utilities Commission. Content presented here is independent of my employer, but by night, I am an independent researcher focusing on the intersection between climate adaptation and housing policy. And I'm also aiming to apply to graduate school to work more on this topic in the future.
Kelly and I are both urban planners and managed retreat researchers at MIT. We've also started a planning consulting firm focused on helping under-resourced municipalities develop better buyout programs called buy-in community planning. Kelly actually presented in the session yesterday. And then finally, we have Ross Patel on our team, who's an urban technologist specializing in smart city planning. Next slide, please. So I'm going to present a little bit about the work that we've done so far in this accelerator. Next slide, please. We've started out our work by conducting a robust literature review of several different factors, including what are the key migration driving factors. So we've broken those largely down into push and pull factors. Those include labor markets, amenities, housing, and social networks and kinship ties. And these are the factors which really drive people's decisions about when they'll move, where they want to move. And I think we've seen in the literature that the vast majority of moves that people take are due to these factors and not primarily due to environmental influences such as shocks or other long-term stressors such as drought and food shortages or more persistent flooding or amenities like milder weather. As Isaac will describe about mobility, evacuees from extreme weather events tend to make shorter in-state or even in-county moves. Next slide, please. We've also studied behavior to try to understand migration decision-making and how demographics might affect or influence migration. So we've seen that there's different forms of belief which shape behavior. Next slide, please. We've also learned that in addition to our push and pull factors, which you see shaping people's movement throughout regions, there are key household attributes which limit or enable mobility. And we've mapped these out in these kind of large webs to try to understand what the key factors might be for decision makers to consider. Next slide, please.
We have also attempted to contextualize climate migration within New York in light of broader migration trends in the US, documented by demographers and social scientists. So nationally, the vast majority of moves undertaken by the US residents are local, that is within one's county or state, as we've seen by some presentations also made during this conference. We've gotten our data from Harvard University's Joint Center for Housing Studies. And next slide, please. So these local moves are primarily motivated by housing, but long distance moves are primarily motivated by jobs. One exception is for older Americans who make long distance moves for family related reasons more than job related reasons. We believe it is important to foreground how mobility rates and homeownership rates are declining among young adults while wealth inequality is rising. Interstate migration rates have also declined, making up less than 1/5 of all moves in 2019. It's around 20%. Most interstate migrants are moving towards the Sun Belt and Pacific Northwest. And we've also been able to document that housing availability and affordability is restricted by local income levels, demand, local land use laws, neighborhood opposition, and the cost of construction.
In our literature review, we've looked into the kinds of climate stressors and shocks that New York State has looked at before and the kinds of impact assessments that they have conducted. Of the range of different push factors, meaning things which may drive people from where they are currently living, we focused in on coastal flooding hazards and particularly sudden onset disasters such as hurricanes due to the availability of discrete spatial data. I'll talk a little bit more about the spatial analyses that we've conducted as background in a minute. Next slide, please. Because hurricanes are difficult to predict, and therefore, if you're participating in a modeling accelerator, represent a real challenge, we've looked at historic events such as Hurricanes Maria, Isaias, and Sandy, which hint at the different categories of migrants. And so of those climate migrants, people displaced by the far-reaching effects of climate change, we've seen that there are several types which already exist in the United States. These include homeowners wading through the process of getting a buyout of their flood-prone home. There are families who may be evacuating during climate-exacerbated disasters. And then there are households moving en masse from places experiencing environmental and economic changes in an unsupported manner, so without government assistance. There are a number of recent studies of climate migration, retreat, and relocation within New York State, which focus on the vulnerability of starting places, the characteristics and motives of migrants, the implementation of supportive relocation programs such as buyouts, and increasingly the welfare of families after they move. Next slide, please.
So something very important to note that more people are leaving New York State and other Northeastern Great Lakes states that are moving in, despite being self-proclaimed climate havens. This is creating a negative net flow of the domestic migration. The tight and expensive housing market has worsened during COVID as well. According to the housing report released by the New York State Association of Realtors, for 17 consecutive months, the number of homes available has dwindled in year-over-year comparisons. Meanwhile, the statewide median sales price in the New York real estate market continues to climb from $260,000 in April 2020 to $370,000 in April 2021. That's an increase of 42.3%. The housing affordability index has dropped by almost 25% in the last year. That's around the quarter. New housing construction across the state has also created during COVID-19, which even before then had never fully recovered to pre-Great Recession levels. And This is, talking about unsubsidized market rate housing. Next slide, please. What's even more shocking in some cases for some people is that thousands of units of subsidized and unsubsidized affordable housing will be threatened by sea level rise in New York State in the future. According to the first ever national analysis conducted in 2020 by Buchanan et al., New York City has the highest number of affordable housing units exposed to flood risk by 2050. That's more than 4,700. Homes in any coastal area are at risk of flooding, but affordable housing is especially vulnerable, the researchers say, because it tends to be older and of lower quality than other housing. And people who live in affordable housing are more likely to be low income, disabled, and single parents, and may not have the savings to bounce back from an emergency like a flood. And of course, there are other factors. Next slide, please. And of course, there are other factors affecting migration in New York State. Modern zoning makes building the appropriate amount of housing for new climate migrants difficult because it limits the density and form that can be built, so less people can be housed. In addition, skyrocketing construction costs have made building a necessary amount of units more difficult because if it's too expensive to build a lot, you have to build less. And if you have to build less, you can't accommodate as many people. This low vacancy caused by these is also leading to making it more challenging to move, since of course, low vacancy means less options and less space. And this is particularly true for subsidized housing vacancy or affordable housing vacancy, where the waiting list for the New York City Housing Authority, which is the public housing system in the city, can be so long that one person was on the waiting list for 10 years as of 2019 and still did not receive a placement. 10 years, decade.
So we've gone through some of the ways that we hope to contextualize this issue of climate migration for New York State policymakers. We've also begun conducting a GIS analysis to understand hurricane inundation impacts and potential migration pathways for populations that are vulnerable to those hazards. Next slide. So we feel that a GIS-based methodology allows us to analyze multiple related parameters in the migration question. It helps us to answer the questions: what areas are at risk, who lives in those areas and who may be at risk, what kinds of housing are impacted, and what might need to be replaced in the future, including what kinds of typologies that housing fits into. And then what are some similar areas by demographics and by housing type that those folks might move to. Next slide, please. To start off with, my colleague Kelly looked into areas of high environmental hazards. So we use the hurricane inundation zone data that is available for New York State and combined it with parcel data to get a sense for what parcels are vulnerable to hurricanes of different strengths. And there's such a great number of parcels threatened that I think it's helpful to add additional layers to understand social vulnerability in addition to environmental hazard in order to think about appropriate policy responses. Next slide, please. So who is vulnerable to being harmed? According to NYSERDA itself, within the coastal zone, elderly and disabled residents and households without cars are particularly vulnerable to flood hazards as they have more difficulty evacuating in a timely manner. Low-income populations may face greater challenges recovering from the damages resulting from extreme weather events than wealthier populations. And racial and ethnic minorities are more vulnerable to extreme events than non-minority populations for a number of reasons, particularly Black and Latinx people represent a significant portion of the people living in the New York City flood zone. And as we'll highlight, in the housing context, face significant amounts of discrimination as renters. And so that might make their moves more challenging. Next slide, please. in order to get a sense for where those socially vulnerable populations live, we used EPA EJ screen data and census data to map the percentage low income in various areas in New York State, and then overlaid that with the number of parcels affected by hurricanes in tracts with 30% low income populations or higher. Next slide, please. We also looked at percentage minority, and next slide. And even did a deeper dive into where Black populations living with that kind of hurricane risk are. So as you can see, Queens and Brooklyn in particular, and Long Island have high concentrations of those folks. Next slide, please. We've begun looking into additional parameters, including what kinds of housing may be affected in high vulnerability, high minority areas, and what it might cost to replace such housing. You know, we know that some work of retrofitting has happened since Superstorm Sandy, but there's still a lot of retrofitting that would need to be done, or a lot of relocation that might need to happen in these areas. Obviously, the way that kind of work would need to progress would be with great sensitivity to the housing disparities that already exist and the kinds of injustices that these people living in these flood zones have been subjected to historically. Next slide, please. We've also looked into renting versus rental versus owner-occupied units, because that affects the kinds of policies that might be available for state policymakers to support folks living in these different kinds of units. Next slide, please. So some other items that we've picked out to pursue over the course of this year as our work progresses include looking into the distribution of some of these other populations that state policymakers have said are vulnerable, including where elderly and disabled residents live, where households without cars are, low English-speaking populations, and other factors such as building age and structural integrity, which might, as we mentioned before, affect how much somebody was harmed by flooding, or how much a building was harmed by flooding. We're also curious about vacancy rates and employment opportunities for understanding some of those kind of pull factors and where people might be able to move to. And we're interested in hearing comments from you about where we might focus and what you might be interested in understanding, or you think that New York State policymakers might be interested in understanding. And finally, next slide, please. We're planning to build some GIS-enabled Python models to help automate these kinds of decision-making support tools for policymakers. I'll hand it off to Isaac for our next steps.
Thank you for the wonderful summary of our GIS work with Samu. So I'm pretty sure you're all wondering what we're doing next. So next slide. Oh, good. So the first part of what we're doing next is we're looking at the housing vulnerability analysis. First, we're going to be using First Street Foundation data to determine the vulnerability of buildings and residents, such as which areas may see the greatest need for retreat strategies, which areas may be safe and smart places to increase housing density. We're going to identify indicators of household strandedness. So strandedness are households who would like to move out of high hazard areas but are unable to do so due to the social, economic, legal, or physical constraints. And we want to use housing market analysis to look for conditions restricting the mobility of owners of flood-prone housing. We will also investigate current housing stock growth trajectories and patterns, analyze policies and tools to enact sustainable, inclusive, housing growth in low hazard areas.
And then we wanted to talk a little bit about what kinds of policy analysis we might engage in, both looking at past policies that New York State has utilized to support climate migrants, as well as potential future policies that they might, and programs that they might investigate. So we know that climate change is already making certain areas of New York State undesirable and unhealthy places to live, and that wide-scale migration is already occurring. But that escaping environmental factors, as we said, is rarely the sole motivation of migrants. They seek housing, jobs, proximity to family, education, and other kinds of pull factors. We also know that climate exacerbated environmental migration will likely lead more people to move to, within, and out of New York State. However, these populations will each have very different motivations, particularly regarding pull factors and needs for the kinds of support that government might be able to provide for them. So folks moving to New York State, many will be people moving for jobs and kinship ties. Particular ethnic enclaves in New York City may grow in size as they have in the past due to droughts, stormwater flooding, bankruptcy, and starvation in Latin America, or storms in the Caribbean like Hurricane Maria. We're interested in understanding how successful hurricane relief centers have been at supporting those populations and their kin who are often receiving those migrants. Within New York State, we're interested in understanding how buyout and relocation programs, which are have been slow, complex to administer, and differentially available to communities and to households, can be improved. And then on the renter side, affordable housing shortages and landlord discrimination will continue to limit renters' abilities to find housing outside of high hazard areas. So what kinds of policies and programs might help address these issues? We look forward to discussing and taking your questions. Thank you.
So this wraps up our section of the presentation. Of course, we'll be working on it more in the future. And thank you for your time. It's been a pleasure to host you. And we look forward to completing this project and doing our best to help New York State.
Thank you for that great presentation. So now I'll be introducing Anna, who will be presenting on municipalities and climate immigration projects. Thank you.
All right. Good morning, everybody. How's everybody doing? I am with the National League of Cities, and I am a program manager there. I work on the resilience portfolio. And I just wanted to give you a little bit of background on sort of what this project is, how it's related to ASAP, and why NLC. Next slide, please. So the National League of Cities is a membership organization for cities and elected leaders. And we've got about 20,000 towns, villages, and cities across the country that are members, and their elected officials are quite active. We have 2 summits a year that are about 4,000 council members and mayors that come and attend. And when I started working there, I had no idea that this organization was sort of this extensively working with local elected officials. And I'm coming in there as a resilience practitioner, a climate practitioner. And I was like, wow, this is incredible access to cities that are not really getting the same level of attention as, say, sort of C40, 100 resilient cities. You know, half of our member cities are smaller than 50,000. So there are a lot of small towns, there are a lot of suburbs, there are a lot of cities that really aren't getting that kind of attention. And really that exposure to climate action, climate adaptation. A lot of this language is not used there because there's such a wide variety of cities. So I noticed really, wow, the vast majority of cities are not addressing climate impacts. And as a result, you know, they're not sort of taking action to address these issues. And so I realized, wow, even less are thinking about climate-induced migration. And so a couple of years ago, you see this photo of these happy folks here. So that's Missy Stultz with the city of Ann Arbor. That's Matt Hauer, and I forget the gentleman's name, but he is the gentleman that runs the water treatment facility at the city of Ann Arbor. So a couple of years ago, Missy applied for a grant through an NLC program, a resilience program. And her project she proposed to try to figure out, well, how would climate-induced migration impact population numbers in her city, and consequently, how would that impact sort of large infrastructure projects, such as an improvement to the water treatment plant. And so I thought this was pretty brilliant. We funded her project. That allowed Matt to come and speak to the city of Ann Arbor, and it really opened up this whole kind of you know, field of practice that a lot of that I really didn't know about, I wasn't familiar with, and I realized our members really don't know about this either. And this is kind of a tsunami coming in, like just like over there, right? Like this is really, we're starting to see this happen, and it's just going to get increasingly worse. We all know that. And so we started working together with Ann Arbor, and I started diving into this, working with Matt, working with Missy. Can go to the next slide, please. And I partnered with Kelly Leilani Main, who's with Buy-in, Osamu's co-founder. And we started thinking about how can we explain this extremely complex issue for local elected officials who, in general, their priorities are housing and homelessness, opioid use, potholes. I mean, it really, really ranges in terms of reactivity, right? Especially if you're in a small city. If you're in a small city, you are not thinking about these long-term challenges. You are thinking about tomorrow. You are thinking about, you know, the 5 most persistent residents who call your office. So there is this sort of level of reactivity. There's also really a level of, you know, fiscal challenges. Even before the pandemic, cities were really, really struggling. We were well on our way to a kind of a recession. And that was sort of no, please go back to the other slide. It's not done. Thank you. And so we were sort of well on our way to this fiscal challenge in cities, and then the pandemic hit. And so it's like, you know, cities are really struggling to pay for basic services. And so Kelly and I were thinking, well, how do we explain this to local elected officials, this sort of complex issue? And so we were also thinking, well, how do we feed this information up? So if you're looking at this challenge as like cities in general and climate migration in general, how do you explain that? And so we thought, okay, well, let's try to think of this as a spectrum or as sort of categories. On one hand, you're going to have cities that are really, really highly affected. Maybe they're smaller, maybe they can't afford to take adaptation measures. They're struggling financially, economically. And then, you know, and then you've got recipient cities that are already stressed out by housing challenges, transportation, maybe there's traffic gridlock, high numbers of homelessness. A lot of cities in the US are struggling right now with a lot of these kinds of issues. And then on the other side, you have the sort of, you know, we've heard this a lot in the news, Jesse Keenan's research, these sort of climate havens in these cities that are, you know, in the Northeast, right? The research we were just talking about. And so there's sort of the spectrum of cities. And so we wanted to explain like how different cities are going to be affected in different ways. And so we wanted to do a bit of research and kind of interview cities, interview some experts, and create a really simple, easy to read guide that local elected officials could wrap their brains around. Next slide, please. So just, I don't want to go too deep into our findings because we are still writing the paper, but just initially, you know, and look, none of this is going to be new to you guys, right? You guys are experts. None of this is going to be new. But obviously, you know, there is a strong interest from cities, from elected officials in these cities that are feeling really the brunt of this, right? The smaller cities on the coastlines, those who are getting hit by wildfires, to convene and talk and really just, you know, take a breath and say, here are the challenges that our cities are facing, and what do we do? We've got development challenges, we've got people who want to build, we've got hurricanes increasing. So, you know, they're really in this bind where they cannot really talk about some of this stuff publicly, and they just really want to unload and figure out, okay, what are the solutions that we can start to bring to our residents? What are the discussions? How do we even approach retreat? So that's sort of what we found from the sort of the very vulnerable city type of cities. And I will note that as we heard in the last presentation, you know, folks are still moving in droves to these high hazard areas, right? So you've got people, and the pandemic just exacerbated, I should say accelerated. To me, it's exacerbated because we should not be moving to some of these areas. But, you know, it just accelerated some of the movement to these smaller coastal cities that are super at risk. So right now you've got an increase in population, right? In some of these cities that are at very high risk, not a decrease. People are not leaving yet, right? And so it's almost creating this kind of bubble, like, whoa, people are moving. And then, you know, we're all sort of waiting, right? Like, what is going to happen? We're trying to address it, but I know all of us are kind of like, oh God, like we're just really hoping for not a market-driven retreat, which could be disastrous for lower income people and people of color. So in any case, that was a little digression, but so that's sort of the vulnerable cities, the type 1, we called them. So then for type 2 and type 3, which would be sort of the middle cities, the recipient cities, that's, you know, like city of Orlando, city of Chico, cities that have been in, you know, accepting and welcoming displaced residents from Puerto Rico, from nearby areas that were hit by disasters. And so you've got, you know, serious housing crisis that, if it already was in existence there, is a lot worse now that you've got to sort of, you're welcoming all these people now, right? So that was, I mean, again, this is really obvious, like protect affordable housing stock, whatever you have, protect it, and then really try to make an effort to either densify or, you know, change your zoning. That's what the city of Orlando did. And so that was really sort of the critical discussion point for the sort of the recipient cities. And then same with type 3. So you've got cities that like Cincinnati, Buffalo, that are thinking about, okay, you know, maybe in the future, folks are going to start moving here in higher numbers. Cincinnati is already growing pretty quickly. They've seen a pretty nice uptick in their population. And so again, housing is so critical. So housing may be affordable there at the moment compared to other cities like New York, San Francisco, but for, you know, the salaries there and, you know, the sort of like income levels, et cetera, you know, you have to watch those housing prices. And then another thing we learned that, again, I don't know if this is this was sort of obvious to me, but it's sort of a painful reminder of the divisions that you're dealing with, right? But in many states, such as Florida, Texas, Arizona, I'll call them out. They are Dylan's rural states, and they will tell their cities what they can and can't do. And this is a huge problem. So when you have cities that want to enact, say, a stormwater fee, or maybe it's a high tourist, you know, like Flagstaff, they get a lot of tourists. They want to protect their natural resources. They want to have like a small tourist tax or fee on something. The state says, no, 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 you can't do that. And so that sort of resilience building and that those funding mechanisms in particular are shut down. And so, so that's a huge challenge for cities that are trying to prepare for their existing populations as well as potential incoming residents. And then another obvious solution, right? Partnering with local community-based organizations and nonprofits. That really, really helped out sort of City of Orlando. They had been working with OLA for many years. It's a local nonprofit that works with the Hispanic population. And it turned out to be even a more fruitful partnership when 300,000 folks arrived from Puerto Rico at their door. 25,000 of them settled permanently, but that's still a huge number of folks to handle. Next slide, please. And so I wanted to also bring this back to modeling, because I think that's just so important, because this whole project started through meeting Matt and brainstorming and having these amazing discussions with him and Missy and Beth. And, you know, ASAP was a huge part of this. I wouldn't have met Kelly. I wouldn't have met all of these fantastic folks. And so, you know, the modeling is really, it's key here, but it's also not the single most important thing, because currently some of our models are, you know, they range in sort of outcome, right? So Matt's models differ from Vivek Chandas's models, right? They've got different outcomes. You know, Vivek uses agent-based modeling, which is different from Matt's modeling. And so, you know, there's all sorts of different types of models out there, and they're all based on the assumptions that you are like sprinkle into the model, right? And so as this field grows, the models are changing. But what is obvious is that some cities are at high risk and people will be retreating. They already are retreating. They will need to move in increasing numbers. And this is going to put a stress on revenue for these cities. So some of these things are like, it's a no-brainer, right? You don't need a model to tell you that. Of course, the model can help, because that can be a point of discussion. You say, hey, I read this article and wow, it looks like we're gonna potentially be a receiving city, right? We already are. Oh, this makes a lot of sense, right? It's a conversation starter, you know? I think in terms of like, you know, scenario planning, it's also super useful. But right now we don't have that crystal ball to say how many people are gonna move where and when, right? So we don't have that level of accuracy, and we may never, but I think these models give us a really good idea and a good sense of where people may go. And what do you do if you're that city? How do you prepare? How do you look at other cities that have dealt with similar challenges and start to think about, you know, what you can do? And you know what? Building resilience is good practice anyway, right? So investing in your affordable housing is good practice anyway. Doesn't matter if you're accepting more people or not. Protect the folks who are there now, particularly your frontline communities, right? So I think in terms of encouraging this kind of discussion among city officials, and definitely getting that conversation started between the city and residents, and having these wonderful sort of community-driven discussions. I've seen some great panels at this conference about how to do that, and that's just been you know, fantastic. So I think really spurring discussion, thinking about this at the regional scale too. So thinking about, you know, if Orlando, you know, they're definitely thinking about this. They're working with the county. They've created a regional resilience collaborative to work with the regional planning council in that region, in that area. And so I think thinking about it at that scale and starting the discussion at that scale is super important. And then I think, you know, we really just want this to, we want to normalize this topic. So Kelly and I are really, you know, we're out there, we're trying to, like you guys, you know, bring this to the mainstream and really encourage the normalization of this, that this is not science fiction, this is already happening, and here's what you can do to prepare. So instead of thinking about these numbers out there that are like 100 million people are moving, and, you know, it's like, that's not helpful. Let's think about the individual stories. Let's think about what are the best practices, and let's get to work. So that is that do we have another slide? Let me see. I don't recall. Is there one more slide, Susan? I think that was it. Yeah, that was it. Okay, great. That's my presentation. I look forward to the questions. Thank you so much. All right.
Thank you so much, Anna. That was very interesting and insightful. And thank you also so much to the audience. We've been seeing your questions pouring in. If you have more questions, please leave them in the chat function, the Q&A section, and we'll get to it. And so first of all, I just wanted to continue a conversation with the panel, especially thinking about the environmental justice dynamics of the work that you've shared so far. And the first question I have for the panel, both teams and both presentations, is basically to find out what ways that you think, based on the work that you've done, that climate migration can pose risks for certain groups of people, and how that should be taken into account or resolved. Especially, first of all, thinking about the groups that were mentioned in the presentation on housing, on how older people are affected, single parents are affected, and even disabled people when it comes to housing and moving. So what sort of cushions or mechanisms do you think that we can put in place to be able to make sure that the most vulnerable are not further impacted?
I can take a stab at that. So like I said, I think when you're talking about assumptions around who may or may not arrive in your city, if you are investing currently in good resilience practices and you are taking an equity lens to that, right? It doesn't matter. It's impossible at this point to know exactly who's coming and who, when, where, and when, and what they look like and what they do, right? These are projections, not predictions. And so thinking about how can you create a resilient and equitable community now, today, for your population now, you're going to be in a better position should people arrive at your doorstep. And so I think, good housing policy, investing in your protecting your affordable housing stock. In Orlando, what they did was they rezoned, and this was in like a, fairly, kind of a conservative area, but they were able to change the zoning laws so that folks could actually build like an additional unit or suite on their property. And so, should family arrive from another country, they could stay with their family in an additional suite. And so it's a small step, but I think, that's how you start, right? And so there were other creative mechanisms. Orlando is the home of Disney World and like all the theme parks you can imagine. And so, there are a ton of hotels. And so when folks arrived, 300,000 people arrived from Hurricanes Irma and Maria from Puerto Rico. And, they were able to house folks temporarily in those hotels. And a lot of the hotels did that for free. There's a really good collaborative spirit in that city among stakeholders already. So the existing relationships are there. So I think investing in your existing relationships, investing in, affordable housing, and ensuring that you are on your way to building that resilient community, that is good practice regardless.
Definitely. I would also like to follow up for myself on that. And I am only speaking about my own opinions here, but I definitely believe that housing zoning is critical to being able to accommodate for climate refugees and climate migrants. Personally, I am in favor of statewide zoning mandates coupled with affordable housing requirements to target historically and presently exclusionary areas, which are, in safer zones from climate change impacts, to increase their stock of housing, particularly affordable housing, to welcome in climate migrants. I think we also have to think about redesigning homes in the future to be not only more adapted to climate change, but also be more socially equitable for all these groups. Like if you want to have more elderly folks being able to come to live with their grandkids, we should maybe design these new homes to be multi-generational, be more ADA compliant for people with disabilities, better public transportation also, not just housing, because if you're elderly or disabled, you may not be able to use a car, or even if you're young. Or also, how about we just design towns to be the way they should have been in the first place? I think that's kind of the thing to do, for making a place climate resilient, is to have instead of being sprawling and car centered, have things be a bit more compact, transit oriented, and just a better place to live. I mean, who wouldn't want to live in a better place to live? Thank you.
I think Isaac makes some really excellent points, which are, besides perhaps some additional traumas from the experiences that people have being harmed by environmental hazards, climate migrants are, just like we emphasized, seeking the same things that everybody else is seeking, which is decent and affordable places to live. And so I think really addressing equity, it's the same toolkit that we have for building inclusive cities as a whole. I would say that I think we need to be a lot more specific about understanding the kinds of physical and economic and legal challenges to mobility that keep people stranded in flood zones. So by that, I mean people, who want to move but are not able to move because they don't have the means, or they don't have legal title to their home, which they've had for several generations and it was handed down to them, but they're not actually able to either get a buyout or sell it because they don't have those resources, and they don't have a lawyer who can help them navigate that. And so I think we just really need to think about each of these specific kind of populations. So Isaac's example, individuals with disabilities who are harmed in flooding events, how do you create homes that are ADA compliant so that they have somewhere to move to that's appropriate? Because I think right now, especially in New York, the context that we were looking at, due to this incredible housing shortage that we have, often homes in flood-prone areas might be the most affordable or the only affordable option. And so that keeps people in these conditions of, even when there's repetitive flooding and they know that there's a problem, keeps them stranded in place. So I think we need to look really specifically at those barriers to mobility and create policies that can help people if they want that help.
Yes, thank you so much. Just a follow-up to that, we had a question from the audience beyond, being able to address these areas of vulnerability. The specific question was about how we can best lobby funding to be able to address these different groups of people who are going to be the most vulnerable. So what are your ideas about how funding can be lobbied and directed towards these areas when we think about climate migration?
Well, I can speak on behalf of NLC. We do have a lobbying arm. I am not a registered lobbyist, but we do have a lobbying arm, and we advocate on behalf of cities and their interests. And I would say that it's generally to improve conditions in cities and to sort of push for like more infrastructure dollars or more funding for, you know, like the ARPA funds, like the rescue plan. So it's that's sort of more the kind of the funding mechanisms that we're often looking for in terms of environmental and sort of resilience related. I haven't seen us do anything yet on that front related specifically to migration. As I said, it's kind of a new issue. We're sort of introducing this to NLC members. So I think that's where I'll leave that. I'm not sure if I answered the question.
If I was to interpret this maybe a little bit more broadly as how do you advocate for funding, and not just, you know, lobbying, you know, how do you get your community to get together to ask your local officials for to prioritize the health and well-being of these kinds of specific vulnerable groups, which we mentioned, to kind of help them and prioritize them. I would say, you know, I think that state employees or the agencies are increasingly aware that, you know, not all families are affected the same way by flooding, but that there's a lot of advocacy that needs to happen at the local level to local officials who might be afraid to start these conversations and start these planning processes because they don't know if there's a constituency that will support them. They just know that there's a vocal constituency that doesn't want to talk about these issues. So I think bringing it up with your local officials, and then another really critical pathway for advocacy is talking to state legislators who would need to, for example, there's no funding for a statewide buyout program in New York State right now. And a lot of that would need to happen with the state legislature. So a buyout program, you know, I believe could use health equity as a prioritization method to say, you know, those folks who research shows are the most harmed and have the highest mortality rates in flooding events need to be prioritized in you know, a buyout program, which is just it's a very direct funding allocation to people who are living in these at-risk areas.
You know, great things have been said by Osamu and Anna. And I like to build on top of both of these people by saying that I think a good way, especially in the wake of the George Floyd uprising, is to talk about, you know, climate migration and supporting people in terms of reparations. There's a very well documented connection between redlining and flood risk, and how a lot of historically and presently exclusionary communities have presented people they don't like, particularly African Americans, entering their communities. And a lot of times these communities have been on higher ground, you know, safer environments. And Richard Rothstein, in his book, The Color of Law, talks about how African Americans or other groups should receive prioritized subsidized housing in these areas as a form of reparations. And I think it might be difficult, but at least from environmental justice advocacy, if we're able to connect these two things, it can be a very powerful measure to push forward and bring true racial and economic justice to this world. This is my 2 cents, of course.
Thank you for that. So I think we'll move on to another question. So another question that came from the audience had to do with the presentation on in climate migration in the Great Lakes region. And the questions are centered around the geography of it and what that looks like, especially since the results suggest people moving based on temperature. So I believe that Matt will be the best person to answer this, but I think that the areas that were covered in terms of that particular methodology development was areas like Illinois, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, Indiana, New York, Wisconsin, Michigan, Ohio, and Ontario, Canada. And also in terms of what the dynamics of the temperature change and movement look like, based on information from Matt, it shows that people were more likely to move in from outside the Great Lakes region, from areas that had higher populations, and at the same time, areas that were colder than the Great Lakes region. People tend to move towards the Great Lakes region. So if they had areas rather with lower temperature than the Great Lakes region, they were more likely to move towards that area. And then from the Great Lakes region, people tended to move out towards more colder areas. The explanation around what that looks like is probably something that's still being studied. And so possibly if you want to find out more about this project, I would invite you to participate in the demography workshop that we'll be having at ASAP in December, where more of the details on this research will be presented. Another question that also came up had to do with really thinking about how correlation is not causation, which I definitely agree with, and how questions finding out the direct perspectives of people on what really drives migration is important through conducting interviews. We also think that's key. We'll also like to point out that this research is basically trying to develop foundational tools and knowledge. Therefore, there are opportunities for expanding the project to be able to accommodate those types of inquiry. Also, I would like to mention again that we have a separate aspect of this project, which has to do with finding our perspectives, but from the climate receiving regions itself, by conducting focus groups with stakeholders and communities within the regions, basically to find out what their needs are, to understand what climate immigration might look like for them. So the part that we haven't really incorporated yet is basically like conducting interviews or focus groups with potential climate migrants who will be moving to these areas. And so that's something to think about, like even within the wider research community, of how we might want to expand this. And I believe there are other questions that came in. I think there was a question on First Street data, the use of First Street data. If Samuel, Isaac want to address that.
Yeah, I can take a stab at that. We're still definitely getting our hands around what's actually available from them, and met them during one of the learning lab sessions that we've been participating in. As I think we explained at the beginning, but we're still in the early stages of working on this project. So, we'll be continuing to work on it till December. But what we think is that, having this building scale vulnerability data could be helpful if we overlaid it with some of the social vulnerability criteria that we talked about before. However, a lot of that data is not actually available at the household scale. So we're still trying to figure out how one might kind of create that really, really granular sense of vulnerability. So, combining the hazards with the social vulnerability data. Isaac, did you have anything to add to that?
That's it, just that once we get the hazards in, of course, we're going to be using to see, which areas might be more dangerous and which areas might see growth or might be better suited for growth. But basically everything that's been covered in the presentation and what Osama just said.
I just wanted to pick out something from that previous question that you fielded too, Susan, which is the importance of validating some of this mapping, this very top-down kind of mapping with, qualitative data, with surveys, with interviews. That's something that our organization does pretty extensively. in other places. So I'll give the example of DeSoto, Missouri, where we're working, we've done a household survey where you go, in the conditions of COVID, we were going with mailers and we tried an online version. And then eventually we're going to start doing kind of this tablet administered survey door to door to ask people about their experiences with flooding, to ask them about their housing needs, and then to understand how that, how those factors might play into their decision to relocate, or what kinds of support they might need if they want to relocate. So I think that it's really important to validate that kind of mapping with things that are very bottom up, and also can allow you to get at some of the more causal reasons that people say that they want to move. So I just wanted to add that.
Yes, thank you so much for that. I think that's why moving into the second year of this project, really what we wanted to do with it was to find ways on how we can center and have affected communities be in control of this methodology development, in whichever ways that they believe will be the best way, what that will look like. So that would be developed or figured out during the conversations that we're having, the ongoing conversations with these communities on how they would like to take control of the data. Also, I just wanted to put forth a clarification that the migration from Great Lakes is not from colder areas to the Great Lakes, because the Great Lakes is really cold, but more about people moving from warmer areas towards that region. So that's a clarification. Another question that came from the audience was about what drivers were used in the study. And so basically right now, with the demographic data, it's only temperature that's being considered, but I believe that may be expanded in the future. And then a separate question that has come in has to do with the funding conversation. If any one of my panelists want to jump in about how we could start those conversations with local council or state representatives on funding. When we think about funding for these vulnerable groups, how do we even start these conversations? Or Anna, you can also step in.
Sure. So I think it's definitely a challenge, but it's not impossible. People who don't believe in climate change believe in other things, right? They have things in the community that they love and cherish. And so starting there is a really good point to kind of start the discussion. Like, what are the assets in the community that they love and appreciate? Maybe they love their sports team, the stadium, maybe the stadium is at risk of flooding. Start with economic impacts. That's the language of money is powerful, right? So talking about, hey, we're having serious heat waves here that are impacting how and when people can work on construction outside, right? So like starting the discussion, like, you have to kind of put yourself in their shoes, get out of your own head and think about, well, what are the things that are important to people who, are coming from a more conservative point of view. And so that's a great place to start the discussion. And also, like, the idea that $1 invested, there's all these different, like $1 in, $6 out, $11, there's a lot of different versions of this, but what happens if you don't spend that money? How much money are you going to lose if you don't spend a bit of money today? What are you losing tomorrow? So I think those are the kinds of discussions you can start, really. So economic, and then really thinking about the assets that folks cherish and appreciate in their community. That's a place to start. And sort of taking climate and the politics out of it. Like, just take that out of it, and focus on what is the impact And that's how you get to your goal. And so it's hard for us because we're coming from the science mindset, but you got to kind of put yourself in someone else's shoes and just think about what's important to them and get to them that way.
Yes, thank you so much. We have just about 5 minutes left. So Isaac, there's a quick question for your team. Did you identify thresholds or tipping point conditions that could trigger migration in your study?
I believe we did. Osama was our expert on that, and his computer just died, and he just.
Okay, thank you.
So please feel free to email Osama about that. And Kelly, yeah, it was Osama and Kelly who really did that aspect.
Okay, well, I'll try to share my screen right now to show information. If anybody has any questions about getting involved with ASAP, like I said, ASAP is an organization that brings together different adaptation professionals to work on some of these issues. We have a separate project, which is a member-led driven group of adaptation professionals who meet together to talk about climate migration and managed retreats. You can check out our website for all of these resources. And also specifically, if you have any questions, please email me at saco@adaptpros.org. If there are more questions that came up that we were not able to cover during this presentation, please email me and I'll be able to get to it. And also, if you're interested in joining us, like I said, check out our website. We have in December a workshop, the Demography and Climate Change workshop, where we'll be talking more about some of these things that we've covered briefly during this presentation. So please join us. The date is yet to be determined. And I will just ask my panelists if they have any closing remarks within the next 3 minutes that we have before we close. Thank you so much. This was a very engaging and insightful conversation. And I hope everyone in the audience has been able to benefit a thing or two from it.
It's all my pleasure, Susan. My only closing remark is, thank you so much for this opportunity. It's been my greatest honor and pleasure. And the other thing is that if your local elected officials are not listening to you about climate, try to replace them, vote them out. That's another strategy I like to use.
That's pretty solid. I would say that, good resilience practice and thinking about equitable practices, regardless of what is going to happen in the future, and protecting your existing population, particularly in the case of cities that may be growing or want to grow, that's good practice anyway. And so that's one thing. I would say, what's the cost of inaction? If you are not thinking about these issues now and you're not investing today, what is the cost of you not doing that? So I think that's two themes that I would leave everyone with. Oh, and one more. I would say let's also normalize this topic and take it away from the huge numbers, the 30 millions, the 100 millions. Let's bring it back to stories and communities and talk about who these families are, and really kind of humanize it and take away. And also, let's maybe stop using the word migrant. These folks are just displaced. So let's think about this in a really human way, and what would happen if it happened to you. So humanizing it, thinking about it in a really personal way.
Just have a final thought about the importance of stories and talking to people. And I think that is really a huge humanizing tool for us to be able to pull on, is to be able to go to folks who have moved and to their families and to say, and kin, and say, how has this move benefited you, what's been challenging about this move, and to really, or for people, go to people who want to move and ask them questions about what they're looking for. I think that those stories can be a real conversation starter with local policymakers when they're saying, well, who is it exactly that wants to move, and what is this problem? I don't understand. To be able to say, well, it's this family and this is the situation they're in, and they're looking for another house, but they can't afford anything outside of the flood zone, unassisted. There's nothing in their price range that's an appropriate size for them, and is close to their workplace. Like these, just really trying to kind of put a face on the people who, and not letting it become what I think migration often becomes in this country, which is this faceless wave which people demonize.
Thank you so much to everyone in the panel. We've reached the time. I hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
It's all my pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.